Hey, everybody. This is Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to the Daily Check-In for April 23rd, 2020. We are going to be talking about VMware Cloud, aka VMC, and my thoughts regarding it. So that should be interesting. And so, very helpfully, the lawnmower service that we have has decided to show up right now. So you might hear a little buzz in the background, but I'm live streaming at 11:30 because that's the deal. That's the deal I made with you. I'm going to do this at 11:30 every day. So, rain or shine, lawnmower or not, here we are. Few housekeeping items before I get to the topic at hand. Just two. One, the podcast is now on Apple Podcasts. So, if you're looking for the daily check in, you'll be able to find it through Apple Podcast. That's exciting. I'm now on all the platforms and podcatchers. So, you can find it if you prefer an audio version of this. I try to publish it the same day if YouTube lets me. Second thing, tomorrow I'm planning to do an Ask Me Anything session. I would love to hear from you. Tell me what your questions are. Anything. That's the whole point. Ask me anything. Whatever you think you might want to hear me talk about, here's your opportunity. Let's do it. So please get those questions in. You can leave them as a comment on this YouTube video. You can send them to me via Twitter. You can send them to me via LinkedIn, whatever makes sense for you. Get those questions in. I want to have something to answer tomorrow. If I don't get any questions, I guess maybe I'll postpone it. I don't know. We'll see. All right, to the topic first, let's check in. How are you? You doing all right? It's Thursday. It's almost the weekend. We almost made it. That's good. It's way too cold for April. I'm just going to go ahead and say that, which makes quarantine a little more difficult because I want to get the kids outside, and it's a little too cold sometimes for them to get outside. We were supposed to get a wintry mix today. I'm in Pennsylvania in April. You don't get a wintry mix. It should be like raining or sunshine. Anyway, that's enough complaining. Let's get to the topic at hand. VMware Cloud. VMware on AWS, or VMC. It goes by a few different monikers. I think the acronym that the industry has decided on is VMC, and that is broadly VMware Cloud on the different public cloud providers. So you have the original VMware on AWS. There's also VMware on Azure through a third-party company. I think it's CloudSimple does that. And then VMware on GCP, which CloudSimple also does. And I believe Google bought CloudSimple, so that's going to be interesting for Azure. That doesn't matter, though. I wrote a post back in 2017 on my blog, netinthecloud.com. I'll include a link down in the show notes. The title of the post was VMware on AWS, You're Doing It Wrong. I think you can sort of glean what my sentiment was on the concept of running VMware on bare metal in an AWS data center when they announced it. And it was not entirely positive. So if I can just pull a few choice quotes here. Not having your admins learn how to use cloud services is simply kicking the can down the lane for another year or two, at which point your admins and possibly your company will be obsolete. That's a little harsh, right? It's not going to be a year or two when your company goes obsolete. But my point was, if the reason that you're adopting VMware on AWS is to avoid making your admins learn how to manage AWS resources, you're really doing them a disservice and your organization a disservice. There's this old thing about what happens if we train our employees and they leave? And then the counter argument to that is, what if we don't train them and they stay? Well, this is the don't train them and they stay. And now when we do want to develop a new application and we want to use one of these new public cloud platforms, we can't because our admins have no idea how to use it. Not a great look. So that was one point that I made. Another one was, when you boil it all down, you basically have a managed colo offering sitting in AWS's data centers. That is still more or less true. Yes, VMware manages VMC for you. So they take care of the patching and upgrades. AWS manages the hardware lifecycle, so the imaging of the servers, the swapping of disks, like all the things that you don't want to do. The same sort of stuff you would get from any colo. The main advantage that was given is that VMware and AWS is right next to all the other AWS resources. In fact, the construct it uses for networking is a couple of VPCs, I believe, and they do some interesting peering stuff. And maybe they've changed that over to a private endpoint in a VPC or something. But basically, that was the idea: is you had a VPC, and the management endpoint for VMware and AWS would have a NIC, a virtual NIC sitting in that VPC, which was how you connected to it. So it was pretty tied into AWS services, and I believe they've grown that over time. That being said, still, it's basically managed VMware in a colo. That's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I don't want us to. The marketing got a little ahead of itself talking about all the amazing advantages of running it in AWS versus any other colocation provider that exists. I mean, if you could just do managed VMware in like Equinix and you'd still have great connectivity, really nice data centers, and you'd have all the regions that Equinix has data centers in, which is a lot now. The third quote, and this is how I sort of sum things up, is cloud native computing is the future platform for modern applications. I think VMware knows this, and for the interim, VMware on AWS was the closest they could introduce to keep their investors happy. But it's the wrong approach, and I think in 5 years' time, they will end up abandoning it in favor of something more modern. Interesting. So it's 3 years later, or almost 3 years later, since I wrote this post. My thinking has shifted a bit in the last 2.5 years, and I think it's interesting to see how VMware has evolved their product set to embrace new technologies. I don't think that they're going to abandon VMware on AWS because, from what I hear, they're making a significant amount of money off of it. You're not just going to walk away from that money. People are using it. So that has refined my thinking a bit. The fact that it has been successful says to me, someone's finding business value in this. Companies generally don't like to just burn money for the sake of burning money. They do like to get some sort of business value. So obviously businesses are finding reasons to use VMware on AWS and the other VMC flavors. Now I'll say, if you are a new company developing new code, don't use this. It doesn't make sense. That's not the paradigm we're in right now. If you think about it, VMware was a common compute platform for the last 13 years. You kind of knew that if you built it on VMware, any organization that you went to was probably going to have VMware, and you could just move it to that. And if you were doing it at a co-location facility, or if you were moving it to VMware and AWS, the common platform for all of those was VMware. That made sense. So lots of applications were built around the virtual machine and the VMware pieces. Those apps might not move nicely to another platform. If you tried to slam it into EC2 or migrate it to Azure, I've seen things trip up. It's not always a smooth transition. If you are moving into VMware on AWS, VMware is basically guaranteeing that consistency. You can vMotion your machine straight from your existing data center to VMware and AWS, and it should be relatively clean. Since that time, containers and Kubernetes have become the common platform for compute in the last year or two, basically. That is what new applications are being developed against. It's not about VMware and virtual machines. It has shifted over to containers and platform as a service. What did VMware do? Well, VMware did what you would expect it to do. They integrated Kubernetes with their vSphere system. So the newest release, vSphere 7, now has support for Kubernetes through Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, or TKG, which is a upstream consistent version of Kubernetes, but it runs on vSphere 7. Now, the caveat to that is that it requires that you're using VCF, which is VMware Cloud Foundation. You can't just install vSphere with vCenter and start using this Kubernetes grid. You actually need additional layers on top of that, like NSX and VCF. That's complicated to set up. I've been trying to set it up in my lab, and that is a non-trivial amount of work to get that all up and running. I mean, vSphere by itself was challenging. adding in VCF and NSX and all these other components, and then Kubernetes as well, is extra challenging. So what is VMware's play long term? I think what they're going to end up doing is sort of a reverse of VMware on AWS. So instead of providing you managed VMware in a co-location facility, now they're going to start really pushing managed VMware in your private data center. So buy the hardware stack from whoever your vendor of choice is. It's going to have everything spec'd out to pre-install VMware on it. And VMware will, through maybe some third party, manage that. I mean, that's sort of Cloud Simple's model, is to provide managed VMware. I think that's probably the most likely road. VMware and AWS isn't going anywhere, and neither is it running on bare metal on Azure or on Google. I think the inverse is going to happen, that you're going to see more and more managed instances of VMware in the private data center, because the value of having extremely skilled VMware admins is not that high, especially if you can farm that out to someone who can manage it as a service, and then have those administrators who were really deep into VMware now start scaling up on things like Kubernetes in the cloud and supporting your developers in these new applications that you're developing. So like I said, my thinking on it has refined a bit. Generally speaking, if you're an enterprise or a large business that has a large VMware infrastructure and you need to move some of that to a cloud and ensure that it's consistent and you have a common management plane, then VMC makes sense. It does. Any other case, though, where you're building a net new application, you are a new company, you don't have this existing infrastructure, don't do that. Don't use VMC. Just build new, and probably build it on containers and Kubernetes, because that seems like the next common compute platform for the next 13 years. So that's my thoughts on VMware Cloud, VMC. I'd love to hear what you think. Hit me up in the comments in YouTube, or reach out to me on Twitter. I'm Ned1313. Until tomorrow, just a reminder, it's going to be an Ask Me Anything, so send me some questions and I'll send you some answers. And I will talk to you tomorrow. Stay healthy and stay safe. Thanks, everyone.